Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Security Space podcast. Today we're joined by Darren Desmond, and what we will be discussing is we're having a bit of a deep dive into the CTI life cycle. The reason that we're doing this topic is because it's a terminology, one of the many buzzwords that is thrown around in the industry, is the CTI life cycle. But we've decided to put the brakes on today and kind of delve in a little bit more on this. What is the CTI life cycle? Why does it matter? But before we get into it, Darren, are you okay just to give the audience a little bit of an introduction to yourself? That's okay.
Sure thing. So I'm Darren Desmond. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the AA. That's the Automobile Association in the UK. We are the largest recovery company in the UK from a vehicle recovery perspective, but we also serve a number of different products to our customers, largely centered around the automotive industry, but everything from insurance, including domestic insurance, actually, to driving lessons. And then when you've been fortunate enough to get caught on a speeding camera, those speed awareness courses as well. So we do a bit of everything.
Okay, I wouldn't have owned up to the last one if I were you, Darren. So you might have the audience get their backs up on that, but no, I say it in jest. But it's great to have you along, Darren, and yeah, thank you very much for sparing some time today. Um, so yeah, I suppose to kind of jump in on it then. Um, Information intelligence, it's this I view it as a currency these days, and there is so much out there. We're in the digital age. There is so much information going around there that has massive effects on everything. Even when we go at the geopolitical stage, information is going into these war zones now, and essentially it's playing a key part. So my first question to you, Darren, is how do you sort of decipher what is noise and how can you actually be like, no, this is information, this is intelligence, and this needs to come into our intelligence cycle because this is crucial to our business, and we need to actually act on said noise that's moved through, and you've graded it as intelligence. So, what's your thoughts on that to begin with, Darren?
So it's quite an interesting. I mean, I love this topic, right? So I was a threat intelligence director for a company for a few years. We focused very much in this space. Prior to that, I had a history in working for both military intelligence and criminal intelligence environments in the Royal Military Police and subsequently in the Intelligence Corps. So I've worked in several different environments where intelligence is fundamental to what we're trying to achieve. Um, but the underpinning building blocks, if you like, of intelligence collection are really around what your intent is in organizations. We in the military you call it the commander's intent. In the commercial world, you talk about intelligence requirements in some more mature organizations. But many smaller or less mature organizations in particular don't even consider how beneficial threat intelligence could be. And you can use it again, it's a very broad term really, but people tend to have quite a narrow view of what it might be, but you can use it um, as part of your investigations if you do have a breach post incident, but you can use it, to try and prevent or limit the impact of breaches. And many organizations use intelligence in very, very different ways for competitive advantage, right? You have market intelligence, business intelligence, yada yada. So there are various different ways of shaping it, but it all starts with your intelligence requirements and what you need. So typically, there's no shortage of data these days. And you mentioned intelligence and information in the same sentence earlier. The two are quite different because
Mhm.
information is ungraded intelligence effectively, and intelligence is graded information that's been derived from multiple data sets that's been analyzed, and then there's an output. Without going too much into the actual dictionary definition. So there's very different, distinct shapes to this topic. However, going back to my point at the top of the response, if you have a clear view on what it is you're trying to achieve by the collection of intelligence, then you can target what you collect first and foremost and where you collect it from. Um, there are a number of different processes within the intelligence cycle to help you get it, which we'll probably take a dive in a bit later on without getting too pointy-headed about it. But yeah, so for me, it's a vital piece of the cybersecurity puzzle in any organization, whether you're commercial, military, government, doesn't matter. But it's how you apply it and how mature you are as an organization when you decide to start using that, because you can use it if you're a fairly mature organization to understand what your assets look like, for example. And we'll probably expand upon assets in a bit as well.
Hmm. So to come in on that then, obviously with your role, you've come into organisations and you've come into greenfields and you've gone into established organisations as well. When do you start having a look at your CTI? 'Cause if you haven't got like your logs in place, like it's not necessarily relevant right then. But surely it's quite one of your one of your first few jobs that you get in there, or is it not? Correct me if I'm wrong. So because you touched on there a couple times, like it depends on the maturity of your organisation.
Mm.
So firstly, yeah, when do you actually start having a look like we need to embed a CTI life cycle here?
Well, again, it depends on how you define it, right? Because
Okay.
if you think about it, when you go into a greenfield organization, so I take my role for instance. If I was a CISO coming into a greenfield organization, the first thing I'd want to know is what assets we have in the organization, how are they tracked, monitored, how are they managed in life. So how are they brought into production, how are they managed during that production life cycle, and then how they're decommissioned. And all of that information really results in me gaining some intelligence about my asset environment because I need to know that because I need to know what I need to protect.
Yep.
So you could take the view that threat intelligence starts at that point, at the very start of the cybersecurity process, really. So if you have a good grasp on what your assets are and where they are, what sort of state they're in, that is good intelligence for starting your cybersecurity program. But talking about a more mature organization, I have this discussion with my head of SecOps quite often because he always says we're not quite ready for that yet. We're not quite ready because many mature organisations, particularly financial services, that they have a threat intelligence capability as a defined capability within the organisation, and that's their full time job, right? Whereas in smaller organisations, it tends to be not quite a side of the desk activity, but a bolt on to somebody else's day job. So so I think it's different things for different organisations depending where you are on your maturity journey and how you consider or define what threat intelligence really is.
Okay, really good answer. And I suppose then, it's the importance of recognizing how threat intelligence actually relates to what the business does, is what you're saying there. And would you say that sort of a financial organization needs to approach CTI different to a manufacturing organization, or is it the sense of like, look, attackers are attackers, and you've got to defend your castle the same way that you've got to defend your castle. You just might have different points of entry. You might have different weaknesses in said castle. So even though the threats and the attacks might be different, is the process still the same? I was like, cool, our maturity is this. We are defending X, therefore we need to be at this part in the life cycle. I suppose that segues nicely into, what does that cycle actually start to look like then, Darren?
So I guess it is broadly the same approach because effectively you still need direction from your customer, whether that's an internal customer, i.e., senior management, you'd hope,
Okay.
setting the intelligence requirements at the top. So they might say, and it might be fairly broad brush, right? They might say, we need to know who's going to attack us.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you're a car manufacturing company, you'll have probably have a different threat group targeting you from a financial services institute. And again, I don't want to be disparaging about the motor industry, the vehicle industry, but that their levels of security are likely to be less mature than a financial services company, for example. Um, so the process stays the same, but it's the actual the content will probably differ quite significantly.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. So I suppose what I want to ask you then is a little bit of when you start to actually spot we need to start having a look at this in the sense of like, okay, there's a little bit of noise coming outside, and I'll go back to the castle analogy because it's one that I use in my own world quite a lot. And you have had word that there is an attacker at the gate, and therefore, okay, that intelligence, where does that get run up to? How does it run through the business? And then how does your team check that it's credible more than anything?
Yeah, so typically it's the same, not always, but mostly it's the same team. So if we look at it from internal and external perspectives, so from an internal perspective, they might start seeing indicators of an attack or indicators of compromise, and the two are slightly subtly different. Um, but typically, what we do if we start seeing indicators, i.e., there are alerts coming in from the Security Operations Center, um, what we start doing then is following the breadcrumbs. All right, so effectively, you've got an attacker's TTPs might be they attack certain technologies. We'll pick on one technology, say Oracle, for example, right? not to single them out, but just for this example. So if they are coming in from IP addresses that are known to be compromised, known to be used by that threat group, and the threat group's techniques, tactics, and procedures (TTP), as I mentioned a moment ago, are typically to attack Oracle servers, then you can derive quite a lot of intelligence from that. So you know that they're using, they're still using a known compromised IP address. You know they're going to target your Oracle environment. You can apply additional monitoring or go threat hunting around those TTPs. So you would focus very much on your Oracle environment, and
Mm.
as a first activity, because you only have finite resource. You don't have a whole battalion of people um, on the incident response team generally. Certainly not an organisation of our size. So it very much shapes your response. Okay, there's an old it's quite old now. It's probably a Korean era war, a Korean War era rather, and it's called the OODA loop. Have you ever heard of that?
No, no, can't say
The
how.
OODA loop. No, so it's as a brigadier general, I believe it was U.S. brigadier general, called his surname was Boyd. I can't remember his first name, but he came up with the concept of a four-step decision-making approach called the OODA loop, and it was observe, orient, decide, and act. OODA. Okay, observe, orient, decide, and act. And it was all about really observing your enemy or your adversary and determining what they're trying to achieve, and then you orient yourself towards their attack in order to position your defense. You can use it the other way around as well. If you're the attacker, you would do the same thing, right? If you're
Yep.
following that kind of approach. And then you decide what you're going to do, and then you act upon that decision. So you can apply it. It's like a management cycle, right? It's like plan, do, check, act in ISO 27001 or any one of a billion other frameworks out there. It's literally a management approach to dealing with a very complex issue with lots of information readily available, but to try and cut the wheat from the chaff.
Yep.
So really, it's about, as I say, going back to the analogy, trying to understand what you're seeing in terms of your attacker's approach to those Oracle servers, what's known from the open source intelligence you've been gathering on that attacker, and then placing your defenses in the way,
Mm.
the act part of that OODA loop, to prevent the attack from progressing.
Mm. Okay. Okay. I like it. And what if you have an attack from inside the organization? I'm trying to position it
Mm.
nicely, but I'm going down the insider threat route.
An
I can't
insider risk,
put
yeah,
it. So they're in the
yeah,
castle now,
yeah.
and yeah, let's just go with that. You've got an insider threat problem, Darren. How do you recognize that? Because they won't be making the same noises as those on the outside, or will they? What's your thoughts?
Well, there's two types of insider risk, right? There's the
Okay.
real genuine insider, whereas if I was an employee of a company and I decided to do something malicious and I go and do it,
Yep.
or there's the attacker that's become an insider by
Yes.
stealing credentials or compromising credentials. So yeah, you're right. In that first instance, you probably wouldn't see much unusual behaviour. But again, you'd have indicators where it's a genuine employee. You'd have indicators, perhaps they're logging in and out of normal working hours. Um, there are a load of analytics you can derive from different systems that are available out there. We're just implementing one at the moment, but you've got user enhanced behavioral analytics. So any sort of behaviors outside of the norm, once the system has learned the user's norm, anything outside of that is then raised as an alert. And the alerting threshold varies depending on whether it's never been seen previously or it's an activity that's regularly seen. So the risk would vary there. So some of the systems that are available now to monitor insider threat in particular incorporate quite a lot of threat intelligence into the way they approach the alerting around this.
Hmm. Hmm. Nice. And I suppose when your role as a CISO, it's obviously very busy, and CTI is just one part of
Mm,
this. And if you're getting all this noise from outside that everything's happening, because you might have, again, I'm sorry to keep using the castle analogy, but I will, I'll drill this down. Um, Everything could be a threat on your organization, if you look at it in one particular way. There's
mm,
always going to be sort of like a risk assessment to be like, okay, this needs addressing right now. This is business critical. This we need to keep an eye on. And this looks like a threat on paper, but it's not.
yeah,
So how do you actually sort of do you have like a risk prioritization matrix?
yeah,
Or how do you actually all these IOCs, I speak to so many people that are like, it's amazing. I use X, Y, and Z, and it produces this long list of IOCs. But it's just,
Yeah,
again, going back to what we said at the start, it's information, it's not necessarily intelligence at this moment in time. So
yeah.
how do you actually categorize all these, this long list of IOCs?
Yeah. So again, these days, so in the old days, in my previous life, we'd have reports in. I mean, quite often paper-based reports from frontline troops, right? So, or latterly, it comes through on the radio, and the radio operator would pass it through. But typically, low volume and high fidelity. So it'd be possibly somebody's eyeballed the activity itself. They've written a report, sent it through. So you've got a really good, high quality report that you can trust. Right? So it's graded it's graded as first class intelligence or A11 intelligence. Um, that model, that sort of we used to call them a 5 by 5 by 5, right? They grade them three different ways on five different horizontal scales as to the veracity of the information that's being passed and the reliability of the source and whether you should disseminate it broadly or quite narrowly with limited distribution. So it's called a 5 by 5 by 5. Well used in police circles and also military circles as well. But for this type of approach where you're processing data at scale and at pace, you can't readily apply that manually, obviously. So they many of the systems we see today, and there are quite a few of them now actually. I won't single any of them out because they all do a very similar job, but they process at scale using a similar approach. So they'll look at the information that's come through. They'll determine the source to see if the source is credible. They'll grade it against their own risk matrices, and then they'll push the intel out to the recipient, to the customer. So these threat intelligence platforms, you can either buy one and build it in house, or you can buy a service from a third party, and the intelligence gets graded, processed, and then pushed out to the customers that way. But there are a number of different platforms actually. There was a platform a few years ago, or a framework called Sticks, and the transmission method for the data was called Taxi. And I don't know if that ever grew arms and legs. And I hadn't heard about it for a long time. But they were trying to the community itself was trying to build a framework for consistent delivery and grading as well and processing of raw data into actionable intelligence. And the key word there is actionable, because if the information that you've turned into intelligence, if you can't do anything with that, then why are you collecting it in the first place?
Yeah.
It's a bit pointless collecting it. So you wouldn't expend your energy grabbing that data to start with, processing it, grading it, and then disseminating it because it's of no value to the end user.
Yeah, yeah, terrific point. So I suppose to kind of surmise on that is that blend of human and obviously internal teams and sort of your external platforms as well is what will always be it. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but a holistic approach to security is one that will always sort of win because never will we have like a tool that is 100% like going to do the
Mm,
job. I don't think that it will be. I know we're heading to a place, and I will try and avoid the saying AI on a podcast now because it's just been done to death. But yeah, obviously we'd be naive to ignore it as well.
mm,
And because, attackers are using AI in their attacks, and we are using AI in our defenses as well. And I suppose I want to that segues perfectly as to whilst we are using this blended approach between human, internal teams, OSINT as well. Um, what in terms of like your looking at the deep dark web, in terms of
mm.
fraud, in terms of brand protection, it's getting larger and larger, isn't it? All the
Yeah.
different sort of vectors. And I suppose I want to see what is your viewpoint on like, okay, what is probably the most foreseen sort of, attack vector? And I know it depends on organization, but do you
Yeah.
think deep dark web monitoring is probably becoming more of the mainstream now with just how well cyber is getting its own sort of fame now. I think it's not necessarily this man in a hood behind the screen. So
Mm,
in a roundabout way, Darren, what is your thoughts on where threat intelligence is kind of going in the next few
mm.
years? What's your thoughts on that?
So we'll talk about AI first, right? 'Cause you can't
Okay.
have a cybersecurity podcast without talking about AI, like you say. So, but the reality is, I suspect, I don't know, because I haven't had direct conversations with the vendors about this yet. And, I'm not quite ready to open that floodgate, but literal floodgate. I think AI will have the most impact on security from a cyber threat intelligence perspective, because again, I mean, you have to do all the same things you do with any AI tool, right? You have to protect the large language model for start because you don't want the data poisoning. So you have to have an appropriate large language model with the data in it. But if we go back to what we were talking about earlier, processing at scale and speed, AI is perfect for that. So if you can add the context of the organization or industry you're working for, you've got a great source of data for your LLM, and then you can run in context questions or prompts against the LLM, focus very much on your threat environment, understanding what your key assets are, understanding what the impact on your organization would be if you lost those key assets. That's where threat intelligence not only will create a huge difference in cybersecurity, it's already doing so. So to talk about your second point, really, the most benefit I'm seeing at the moment, and I say I'm not opening the floodgates to loads of threat intelligence vendors. I'm not talking to them directly at the moment. We do get some good stuff from the people we already work with, so we're not looking at changing anything. Um, Although we the door is always open to a conversation where something's groundbreaking. Um, but attack path mapping for me is something that's I'm starting to see more and more of in terms of what the vendors are trying to sell us. And for me, it's a natural progression from penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, threat intelligence up front to help inform the system, what your assets are and what the path through your environment is to that critical asset that you're trying to protect. I assumed this was commonplace when I first came into security. I assumed this sort of thing was commonplace. When you look at a physical defense setup, right, you set up defense in depth like you do in cybersecurity. Um, so, at each stage on the way through to the critical asset you're trying to protect, it might be a headquarters, for example, in the military. You would have, claymores in the trees, machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. You'd have minefields. You'd have all the good stuff out there that the military have to create defense in depth to prevent the enemy from attacking from that position. So if we're trying to protect ransomware from coming at us in this position, you want to know that your perimeter is secure. When I say perimeter, I mean that in the old-fashioned sense of the term. If you've got a network that your firewalls are configured correctly, there's not an any at the bottom of the firewall list or at the top of it for that matter. You want to make sure that your email gateway is sufficiently strong, robust, and looked after, managed. Your endpoints are secure. All of that defense in depth still applies, but once the attacker gets through there, where can they go from there? So once they become the insider threat we talked about a moment ago, okay, they're now an adversarial insider, not a full-time employee insider. Where can they go from there? You have to assume breach, and this is a term that we've used in cybersecurity for some years now. But attack path mapping doesn't seem to have caught up with it. I've seen quite a few different products that claim to be able to do this consistently. And unfortunately for the vendors, they then go to live demo and it fails 90% of the time. So I've not seen one that's super convincing yet, although I did see one last week that looked pretty good. But for me, I think that's where artificial intelligence will add the biggest advantage to some of these vendors. I think they'll be able to actually achieve genuine attack path mapping at scale and speed without the significant manual effort required to do it if you're a pen tester, for example. And just to close the loop entirely, you mentioned a moment ago, attackers are using AI. Well, for sure they are, but they've been using threat intelligence for years. The first stage, any attack is reconnaissance. Right, that's an intelligence gathering activity. And if we as defenders don't perform reconnaissance when we're looking to see what we can protect, then we're missing a whole chunk of what we're about. The attackers do it by second nature to them. They'll use any one of a million free tools that are out there to perform reconnaissance on your organization to understand what your external facing assets are, see who your people are on LinkedIn, see how much information they're giving away there, what sort of technologies they're using in the organization. All of that activity, all of that reconnaissance activity is intelligence gathering.
Hmm. I was hanging off your every word then. I really enjoyed that. I was really well answered there, and I really sort of enjoyed getting into the weeds of the CTI life cycle. And I know that we've only got sort of a few minutes left, so I just wanted to kind of bring it back up more to a strategic viewpoint with one of my last questions.
Hmm.
And it is a little bit of, I might be framing this horrifically, but do you perceive threat intelligence as the key to being a business enabler in the boardroom? And let me caveat that in the sense of, for years and years, obviously security has fought with development and engineering for budget, and it's always
Hmm.
sort of been the ugly duckling of the group. It's always been a little bit of an afterthought. The engineers can go build this product, and it's like security. There you go slap a plaster on it, and then we can get it out. And it's like, okay, cool. I know that we've touched on the fact that we are getting more limelight. There's definitely been more money put into
Mm,
security in the last few years. The amount of sort of vendors that are they're coming up now with these amazing products is a testament to see where the industry is heading. And so it's a good place. But in the actual boardroom of a company that you will have sat in, being a CISO and trying to, let's say, like, look, I need X budget to achieve Y by the end of financial year Z. Um, do you use threat intelligence to say, like, look, 'cause you've touched on assets loads this podcast in the sense of, like, you might not understand it in the kindest way, but if we don't secure this, then we might not be able to produce Y, and that will have a financial deficit return or whatever it might be.
yeah.
So linking it back to it, do you see CTI as a business enabler in the boardroom?
So I've got two examples I'll talk about if I may. And this isn't me being disparaging to the people that were involved in this conversation because this isn't their core expertise, right? They're never going to get exposed to this in a month or so unless they have a conversation with the CISO. So some years ago, I was selling a threat intelligence product. We had a globally well-known company come over to speak to us about some stuff they weren't a client of ours at the time. We'd found it, we'd sent it to them, for a number of reasons, not least because we wanted to win their business, because we also wanted to keep the organisation safe. They're a well-known household brand, blah blah blah. And some of the stuff we'd found was dangerous for them in terms of you know compromising the organisation again from a multiple perspectives. Really, they flew somebody over. We had a meeting with them. We showed them what we found, where we found it from. We showed them the intelligence. We showed them the source of the intelligence and how we went around gathering it and proving that it was what it said it was. And they said, this is really fantastic. And we thought, this is in the bag here. It's absolutely, we've got a sale in the bag, and the easiest sale we'd ever made. I said, but the reality is, we want you to stop doing this and stop sending it to us because we don't want to know about it. It's too big a problem for us to solve right now. And I was shocked is not a strong enough term for that sort of response, but I see that as a fairly common response. Um, Fast forward some years, I was in a boardroom with a CEO that was present. I'd found a load of stolen credentials, and we were then taking mitigating action to remediate those stolen credentials, minimize the risk to the organization. And the CEO at the time said to me, what is this? Where did this come from? And I told him, and he said, well, why are we going looking for this? And I said, well, because it's very dangerous for the organization if we don't. And he just, again, I don't mean to be disparaging to him because he's a very smart man, obviously. But so he'd never been exposed to this world at all. He didn't really understand the end-to-end attack path, if you like. And going back to what we were saying earlier, there is an assumption in the boardroom by most C-suite members that the IT function knows what it's got and where it all is. Asset management. There's an assumption that's in place. I've lost count of the amount of times I've been talking to other people in my position recently. We've talked about, CMDB, configuration management databases, and how accurate they are. And, the level of confidence in the accuracy of those CMDBs is really, really low generally. And there's some people got, are in a good spot. We're in a pretty good spot where we are, but I wouldn't claim that we know it all. We very rarely get surprised these days. But we went through a phase a few years ago where it's in pretty poor shape. We've invested a lot of time and effort into making sure it's in a good shape now. So there's an assumption in the boardroom that we know all this stuff already. And obviously we don't because teams tend to be fairly small. So is it a business enabler? Absolutely, because it helps you provide evidence that's really tangible to your board that things are not as they think they are. And the challenge we as an industry have is IT is quite expensive, and security is quite expensive. And compared to the other areas they invest in, it looks really expensive. And I think in the past, security functions, and possibly IT functions as well, have had a tendency to try and gold plate everything. I don't think we've shaken that image off yet. So when we talk about business enablers, it helps build a business case, right, for investment in security. And again, I've done this to quite good effect in the past. Um, yeah, so it can help shape a business case. It can create other problems that you then have to go and solve as well, but you should solve those problems. Um, and it could also have a negative effect, as I discussed earlier, with the third party that we were dealing with, where they said, look, we don't want you to send this anymore. It's just too much for us to fix right now. And whilst that's not it's obviously not a position I'd support if I was working in that company, they just didn't have the capacity or the know-how, the expertise in house to deal with it. So they didn't want to know about it because they had other problems. What that they saw were bigger problems. Um, yeah, it's an interesting one.
Absolutely. And yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more with that one. And I'm just glad that the conversations are happening now in the boardroom because it's the conversations that I'm having quite a lot at this moment in time. It's all about sort of communicating the risks to in line with the business strategy, and I suppose that's been the underlying tone throughout this, as there's been kind of like a theme of how threat intelligence all depends on the maturity of an organization and the assets that it's defending. That's been running throughout this podcast. So. Darren, I've really enjoyed the last half an hour with you. And if anybody was to have any questions, what Darren has raised today, or would like to learn more about, obviously, what Darren does at the AA, I understand that you're hiring at the moment as well for a security architect. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
we've got a couple of open
That?
roles at the moment. Take a look at the careers site if you're interested. We'd love to have some additional applicants. So
Brilliant. Darren, once again, thanks for coming on the Security Space podcast.
you're most welcome.